The Midnight Diner. In a small, desolate town, nestled between stretches of endless highways, stood a 24-hour diner named Eleanor's Diner. It wasn't a fancy place, but it was well loved by truckers and night owls who needed a warm meal and a hot cup of coffee. One stormy winter night, Megan, a college student traveling home for the holidays, decided to stop at the diner after hours of driving through treacherous snow. Her car was low on gas, and the icy roads were becoming too dangerous. She pulled into the empty parking lot, the neon sign flickering above the entrance. Inside, the diner was eerily quiet. A jukebox in the corner hummed faintly, but the room felt heavy, like it was holding its breath. Behind the counter stood Charlie, a middle-aged cook with tired eyes, and Ruby, a waitress with a nervous smile. Megan noticed the strange tension in the air, but brushed it off as the weather playing tricks on her. "Coffee, please," Megan said as she sat in a booth by the window. Ruby brought her a steaming cup and a menu. As Megan sipped her coffee, she noticed something odd. The diner's clock above the counter was stuck at 3:15 a.m., even though her watch read 3:45 a.m. She mentioned it to Ruby, who stiffened and quickly changed the subject. Moments later, a man entered the diner. He was tall, wearing a long coat, and his face was partially obscured by a scarf. He didn't say a word, just sat in a booth at the far corner, facing away from Megan. Something about him made her uneasy. She tried to focus on her food, but her gaze kept drifting to the man. His movements were strange, jerky, almost unnatural. When Ruby approached him with a menu, he didn't respond. Instead, he turned his head slightly, revealing a pale, gaunt face and hollow eyes that seemed to stare right through her. Ruby retreated quickly, visibly shaken. Megan leaned in and whispered, "Is everything okay?" Ruby hesitated before saying, "We get strange customers sometimes. Just eat quickly and leave, okay?" Megan felt a chill run down her spine. As she turned to look at the man again, she realized he was gone. His booth was empty, but the door hadn't opened, and there was no sound of footsteps. Suddenly the lights flickered, and the jukebox started playing an old, haunting tune. Charlie emerged from the kitchen, holding a large knife, his face pale. "You shouldn't have stopped here," he muttered. Before Megan could respond, the front door slammed open, and a freezing gust of wind swept through the diner. The lights went out completely, plunging the room into darkness. In the pitch-black silence, Megan heard a faint whisper, "You can't leave." She grabbed her phone, using the flashlight to illuminate the room. Ruby and Charlie were gone, and the diner looked different. The booths were torn, the walls covered in dark stains, and the air smelled of decay. Panicked, Megan ran to the door, but it wouldn't budge. The windows were frosted over, obscuring the outside world. Then she heard it, the scraping of footsteps approaching from the kitchen. A figure emerged. It was the man from earlier, but now his face was grotesque, his eyes black pits. He reached out a hand, and the room filled with a deafening screech. Megan screamed, backing into a corner. As the figure loomed closer, she closed her eyes, bracing for the worst. When she opened them again, she was back in her car, parked outside the diner. The neon sign was off, and the building looked abandoned, its windows boarded up. Shaking, Megan started her car and sped away. As she glanced in her rearview mirror, she saw the diner's sign flicker back on, and the man stood in the doorway, watching her leave. Epilogue. Weeks later, Megan searched online for information about Eleanor's Diner. She discovered that it had burned down years ago in a fire that killed everyone inside: Ruby, Charlie, and several patrons. Witnesses claimed the fire started at 3:15 a.m., the same time the diner's clock had been stuck. Some say the diner still appears to lost travelers on stormy nights, offering them one last meal before they join its ghostly patrons forever. Part 2. The Return. Megan couldn't shake the experience. Even weeks after the incident, nightmares of the diner plagued her sleep. In her dreams, she was always back at that booth, the man with hollow eyes staring at her, and the clock forever stuck at 3:15 a.m. Desperate for answers, she reached out to a local paranormal group online. One of their members, James, responded quickly. He had heard of Eleanor's diner before. Locals whispered about it being cursed. Intrigued by Megan's story, James invited her to meet him in the town near the diner. Reluctantly, she agreed, hoping to put her fears to rest. The investigation begins. When Megan arrived at the agreed-upon cafe, James greeted her with a folder full of articles and photographs. He was younger than she expected, with sharp features and an intensity in his eyes. Eleanor's diner is infamous, James explained, laying out faded newspaper clippings. The fire happened in the 1980s, but strange events were reported long before that. People went missing after visiting the diner, and those who returned weren't the same. "What do you mean?" Megan asked, her voice trembling. James hesitated. They acted hollow, like something had drained their spirit. A few even disappeared later, as if the diner wasn't done with them. Megan felt a chill. Why does it only appear to some people? No one knows for sure, James said, but the diner seems to target those traveling alone at night, and those who survive usually end up drawn back. Megan's stomach dropped. She had been having an overwhelming urge to return to the diner, despite her terror. She hadn't told anyone, but her car had started driving toward that highway on its own, like she was in a trance. "I need to go back," she blurted out. James looked alarmed. "That's exactly what it wants. If you go back, you might not leave again." The road back. Despite James's warnings, Megan couldn't resist the pull. Together they decided to return to the diner, armed with cameras, flashlights, and James's paranormal equipment. The drive was tense. Snow began to fall heavily as they approached the stretch of highway where the diner had appeared. The road was empty, and the world outside felt eerily still. "Are you sure about this?" James asked. Megan nodded, gripping the wheel tightly. "I need to know the truth." As they neared the location, the diner suddenly materialized out of the darkness, its neon sign glowing faintly. The sight made Megan's chest tighten. "It's just like before," she whispered. James set up his equipment in the parking lot, his hands shaking. "This place isn't supposed to exist. Let's get in and out quickly." Inside the diner, the interior was exactly as Megan remembered. But this time, the air felt heavier, almost suffocating. The jukebox played the same haunting tune, and the clock still read 3:15 a.m. James scanned the room with a thermal camera. "There's something here," he said, his voice low. "I'm picking up cold spots everywhere." Suddenly the lights flickered, and the door slammed shut behind them. "We're not alone," Megan whispered, clutching her flashlight. From the corner of the room, a shadow began to take form. It was the man from before, his hollow eyes fixed on Megan. "Why did you come back?" the figure rasped, his voice echoing unnaturally. Megan couldn't speak. James stepped forward, holding up a recorder. "Who are you? Why are you haunting this place?" The figure didn't answer, but instead raised a hand. The jukebox's music grew louder, distorted, and the walls of the diner began to warp. Megan felt dizzy, as if the room were spinning. Leave now or you'll never leave again, the figure warned. The escape. James grabbed Megan's arm. We need to go. They sprinted toward the door, but it wouldn't budge. The man's laughter filled the room as shadowy figures began to emerge from the booths. Ghostly patrons with hollow eyes and twisted smiles. Megan screamed, banging on the door. Let us out. James fumbled with his equipment, pulling out a small vial of salt. He scattered it across the floor, creating a barrier between them and the advancing figures. The ghosts recoiled, hissing in anger. Salt works against spirits, James said, but it won't hold them for long. As the barrier weakened, Megan noticed the clock. It was ticking backward, the hands spinning rapidly. James, the clock, she shouted. Realizing it might be the key, James threw a rock at the clock, shattering it. The moment the glass broke, the ghosts let out a deafening wail, and the diner began to shake violently. The door suddenly burst open, and Megan and James stumbled outside, gasping for air. Behind them, the diner collapsed in on itself, vanishing into the night. Back in town, Megan and James tried to process what had happened. The diner was gone, but the memory lingered. Weeks later, Megan received an email from James. Attached was a photograph he had taken inside the diner. In the corner of the image was Megan's reflection in the window, but her eyes were hollow, just like the man's. The diner wasn't done with her. Part 3. The haunting begins. After receiving James's email, Megan felt her world unraveling. She couldn't shake the image of her reflection with hollow eyes. It wasn't just a trick of the light. She could feel something inside her, something dark and foreign. Her nights became unbearable. Every time she closed her eyes, she found herself back in the diner. The booths were empty, the clock ticking backward, and the shadowy figure of the man with hollow eyes loomed closer with each dream. Desperate for help, Megan turned to James again. The research deepens. James had been digging deeper into the diner's history. He called Megan to his apartment, which was now cluttered with papers, maps, and strange symbols scrawled on the walls. "This is worse than I thought," James said, handing her an old journal. "I found this in a local archive. It belonged to a woman named Eleanor. She was the original owner of the diner." Megan flipped through the journal, her hands trembling. It was filled with ramblings about strange rituals, offerings, and an entity she referred to as the Watcher. "She made a deal," James explained. "The diner wasn't doing well, so she turned to something unnatural. The Watcher promised her success, but at a cost." "What kind of cost?" Megan asked, dreading the answer. "The souls of those who entered the diner." James said grimly. "It became a trap. Anyone who stepped inside was marked, just like you." Megan's breath hitched. "So I'm marked?" James nodded. "The Watcher doesn't let go easily. But there might be a way to break the connection, the ritual." James proposed a dangerous plan. A cleansing ritual to sever Megan's bond with the diner. It involved returning to the diner's location, performing the ritual at 3:15 a.m., and confronting the Watcher directly. "This is insane," Megan said. "What if it doesn't work?" "It's the only chance you have," James replied. "If we don't try, the diner will keep pulling you back until it takes you completely." Reluctantly, Megan agreed. Back to the diner. On the night of the ritual, the weather was eerily calm. Megan and James drove to the diner's location, bringing with them a bag of supplies, candles, salt, a ceremonial dagger, and Eleanor's journal. When they arrived, the diner was already there, glowing faintly in the darkness. "It knows we're coming," James said, his voice tense. As they stepped inside, the air felt heavier than before. The diner seemed more alive, its walls pulsating as if breathing. The clock was ticking again, but this time it moved faster, the hands spinning wildly. "We need to hurry," James said, setting up the ritual circle in the center of the diner. The confrontation. As Megan recited the incantation from Eleanor's journal, the diner began to shake. The lights flickered violently, and the jukebox played a distorted version of the haunting tune. The Watcher appeared, emerging from the shadows. It was no longer the man she had seen before. It was a towering, grotesque figure with hollow eyes and elongated limbs. "You cannot escape," it growled, its voice shaking the room. James threw a handful of salt at the creature, causing it to recoil. "Keep going," he shouted to Megan. Megan continued the chant, her voice trembling. The diner's walls began to crack, and the figures of ghostly patrons appeared, screaming in agony. The Watcher lunged at Megan, but James stepped in its path, holding up the ceremonial dagger. The blade glowed faintly, and the creature let out a deafening roar. "You think this will stop me?" The Watcher snarled. James plunged the dagger into the ground, completing the ritual. A blinding light filled the diner, and the Watcher let out a final ear-piercing scream before vanishing into the void. When Megan and James opened their eyes, they were standing in an empty field. The diner was gone, and the air felt lighter, as if a weight had been lifted. "Is it over?" Megan asked, her voice barely a whisper. James hesitated. "For now, but the mark doesn't disappear easily. You'll need to be careful." Megan nodded, grateful to be free, but knowing the scars of her experience would remain. Months later, Megan had moved to a new city, trying to start fresh. But one night, as she walked home from work, she saw a flickering neon sign in the distance. Her heart stopped. It was the diner, and in the window she saw her own reflection, her eyes hollow once again.